Hey, RetconRaider here. I've been trying to branch out a bit lately, talking about some of the other games I'm currently interested in. But I figured it was about time for me to get back to the game that started it all, Phoenix Point. Now, I've already covered most of the available info for the game, but I figured it might be a good idea to revisit some of the official fiction on the Phoenix Point website. I've already talked about the first 7 stories in my previous videos, but 6 new stories have been released since then, so I thought it might be fun to take a closer look at these new stories and see how they all fit into the speculation and theories I've pitched in some of my previous videos. First, we have Recruiting by Alan Stroud. This is a short, basic story about a military veteran named Lieutenant Harrelson in a small town in eastern Canada. The implication is that Harrelson has received a medical discharge after receiving a traumatic injury that cost him his arm. He's approached by a man named Albert Cianis, a recruiter for Vanadium Inc., who makes it clear that Vanadium wants to hire Harrelson. When Harrelson balks due to his current circumstances and his lack of desire for a desk job, Cianis assures him that he's exactly the sort of person that his employees are looking for. Someone who has a unique perspective on the world, and just how ugly it can be. In the end, Harrelson takes the job. This story is interesting for a few reasons. First, because Vanadium Inc. is involved, we know that the story takes place in the 2020s or later, meaning that it's after the Pandora virus has already started spreading through the oceans. In addition, as Harrelson is getting into Cianis' car towards the end of the story, he notes that the license plate on the car reads New Jericho 16, giving us a small but potentially crucial glimpse into how Vanadium Inc. grew into the New Jericho faction. Another small but notable detail is that Harrelson, due to his injury, has been fitted with a cybernetic prosthetic arm. This is the first official mention we've seen of cybernetic prosthetics in the setting, which could mean that they'll end up being featured in the final game. Next we have The Curator by Thomas Turnbull Ross. Again, this is a fairly short story that's rather light on details, this time taking the form of a series of excerpts from an Arabic journal. The journal belongs to the curator of the Citadel of Qaitbay Naval Museum in Egypt and chronicles the increasingly strange events that take place over a 6-day period. At first, he simply complains about how distracted his assistants are acting, and how filthy the front walkway has become. But in later entries, he notes how his assistants are becoming even more fascinated with the ocean, and begins showing signs of a similar fascination himself. In the final entry, the curator notes that the walkway leading up to the museum is completely covered in muck and slime, and that both of his assistants are missing. This entry ends with the curator deciding to check the beach below the walkway, which apparently leads to his violent end. This story, although short and rather vague, seems to indicate one of the first coastal attacks following the introduction of the Pandora virus. Although we don't know exactly when it takes place, it's worth noting that the Citadel of Qaitbay wasn't turned into a public museum until the late 20th century. Likewise, the growing fascination with the ocean that some of the museum's workers were displaying does seem to match some of the comments Julian Gollop has made about the early days of the invasion. Most notably, how the mists seem to hypnotize some people in coastal regions, causing them to simply walk into the ocean, never to be seen again. Next, we have The Claimed Idol by Alan Stroud. Like The Curator, this story is very short and again very vague. It tells us about the final expedition of an explorer named Matthew, who is traveling through the rainforests of Peru, near the Pura River. He's taken to a series of ancient ruins by his native guide, Laura. There among the ruins, he finds a curious statue of a twisted figure clad in robes, its face obscured behind strange fungal growths. Although his guide warns him not to, Matthew cuts away some of the fungal growths in hopes of revealing the statue's face, only to find carvings of more fungal tendrils beneath. It suddenly dawns upon him that the carving is deliberately inhuman, but before he can fully process his discovery, he is seemingly killed by massive fungal tendrils. This story seems to confirm one of my wilder bits of speculation from the Pandora virus video, which is that the Pandora virus itself has a massive central body made up of an alien fungal growth. It also reinforces the idea that the Disciples of Anu are an ancient organization that traces its root back centuries, with the Pandora virus, or perhaps some similar fungal entity, playing the role of the dead god who wrote their gospel. And then we have Fragments of Knowing, also by Alan Stroud, quite possibly the strangest of the new batch of short stories. It tells of a man who awakens in the restroom of the Gilman House Hotel with a bloody nose and no memory of how he got there. The story is told in a disjointed fashion, drip-feeding us information, but as it progresses, we learn that this man is Paul Hatchell, an employee of the Bureau of Land Management who traveled to the small town of Lyme to fill in some gaps in the land designate records. Throughout the story, we learn that Lyme is a small, strange town along the Manoray River, and that before he lost his memories, Hatchell had been researching a mysterious plague outbreak that occurred there in 1846. Although the exact details are spotty, we learn that he took a bus to Lyme and shortly after his arrival, he somehow stumbled upon something horrible in the sewers, a massive creature and its hungry children. He stole a fragment of a book from the creatures and fled with the assistance of another woman, but he was somehow captured. The townsfolk took fragments of his memory to learn about who he was and what he was doing in Lyme, which brings us back to the beginning of the story where he awoke in a hotel restroom with no memories of how he got there. As he slowly recovers his memories through fragmented dreams and flashbacks, he once again encounters the woman he met in the sewers, and gives her the parchment he stole so that she can deliver it to someone else. Unfortunately, before Hatchell can escape, he is cornered by several of the locals, some of them inhuman, who tell him he can't leave. He's part of their family now, and belongs in Anu's kingdom where all worry and pain disappears. Confronted with the opportunity to willingly return to the cult that has stolen his memories, the story ends with the strong implication that he instead chooses to end his own life. This story is both fascinating and confusing, but it appears to give us some very valuable insight into the disciples of Anu. In the earlier story Disciples of Anu, also by Alan Stroud, the Phoenix Project speculated that the disciples predated the discovery of the Pandora virus in 2022, and this story seems to confirm that. Lyme is clearly a town dominated by the cult, and they in turn seem to date back to at least the mid-1800s. What's more, the old books that Hatchell had in his rucksack spoke of a strange plague that ravaged the town in 1846, which is rather reminiscent of the plague that was mentioned in The Old Man of the Sea. In that story, a weakened version of the Pandora virus infected numerous villagers near Portland in the year 787 AD, slowly mutating them until they died. This could imply that the townsfolk of Lyme suffered through something similar in 1846, but that instead of dying, they not only survived, but also embraced the changes it brought. As an aside, the proprietor of the hotel, Horace Gilman, seems to be a groan-worthy reference to the classic movie The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which featured the famous Gill Man, a creature which inspired the Gill Men included in XCOM Terror from the Deep. His first name, Horace, may be a reference to Horace from Monster Squad, a movie that also featured a parody version of the classic Gill Man, and whom Horace ended up killing with a shotgun. This story was followed by the much shorter and simpler Half Gufu by Thomas Turnbull Ross. Exceptionally short, this story takes the form of a recording transcript. It speaks of a strange island-sized creature that appeared off the coast of Sandoya, near the southern edge of Norway. At first, the townsfolk were curious about the new island, but soon they began to steadily vanish until eventually only one remained. The recording chronicles the last survivor's attempt to reach the mainland. Sadly, her efforts were doomed to failure. No sooner had she reached the deeper waters before she realized she was being pursued by long, thin creatures, something she tentatively identified as lindworms, a type of wingless dragon spoken of in Norwegian folklore. Before much longer, the island vanished into the ocean and began pursuing her beneath the waves. And the recording ends as it emerged once more to swallow her boat whole. Again, this story seems to play into my existing theories. I've previously theorized that the Pandora virus has a massive fungal bulk as its central body, and this living island seems to fit that description. Lore-wise, this story draws from Norwegian folk tales, with both the lindworms, in this case what is instead likely to have been long fungal tendrils like the one seen in The Claimed Idol, but also with the story's namesake, Hafgufu, which dates back to a story from the 12th century about a massive fish that looks like an island. Although it may be sheer coincidence, it's also worth noting that Julian Gollop has cited John Carpenter's The Thing as one of his sources of inspiration. And, much like this story, that film involved a group of Norwegians being systematically hunted and killed by an alien creature. And finally, that brings us to Semper Fidelis by Jonas Kairatzis. I mentioned back in my Pandora virus video that Julian Gollop is a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft, and that was especially evident in a different story, The Tomb of the Phoenix, which essentially rehashed the events of Lovecraft's Beyond the Mountains of Madness. But I've also noted that Julian Gollop is a big fan of John Carpenter's The Thing, and this story, Semper Fidelis, pays direct homage to that. Semper Fidelis tells us about a former Marine who ends up joining the Phoenix Project sometime well after their funding was pulled. It reflects on the Marines' growing frustrations with the group's lack of proper funding, as well as the growing ridicule being heaped upon the organization as it's dragged into the public eye. With the organization in full damage control mode as the media attacks it from all directions, the operative takes it upon himself to investigate a possible incident at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. He manages to hitch a ride with a group of Vanadium Inc. mercenaries who claim to have just acquired a controlling interest in the company that owns the station, EnyoSec. Upon arriving, they discover that the station has been studying a captive mutant, but that it escaped and has already killed off the majority of the staff. The few remaining scientists seem to have committed suicide, and the station's radio operator has been fatally mutated by the microbial mist. The soldiers are set upon by the escaped creature, which kills several of them before they manage to gun it down. Soon afterwards, the facility becomes flooded with the mist, and the surviving soldiers begin mutating despite their filtered clean suits. The Vanadium mercenaries reveal that their helicopters are carrying enough napalm to sterilize the entire facility, and the story concludes with the Phoenix Project operative sacrificing himself to help prevent the mist from spreading any further. This story is obviously one big love letter to John Carpenter's The Thing. Much like in the film, this story involves a group of scientists stationed in Antarctica who come upon a clearly alien creature and, while attempting to study it, are all instead killed when it escapes. The heavily mutated radio operator even seems to be a direct reference to the strange mutations that the Thing would go through while imitating its victims, though the story makes specific mention of his corpse featuring coral-like growths, which might be a reference to this thing. Okay, that's enough of that. Get it back off the screen. Anyway, McMurdo Station is a real-life settlement in Antarctica. But it was also mentioned in the film. It was the settlement that the besieged scientists attempted to contact after they first discovered the alien life form, but poor weather made communication impossible. As a curious side note, this is the first story that makes note of both Lovecraft and John Carpenter being part of the Phoenix Point universe, which adds a rather meta aspect to several of the obviously derivative elements of the setting. From a game standpoint, it's interesting to note that the mutant that escaped and slaughtered the facility personnel is described as having a humanoid shape, clawed hands, and a lobster-like exoskeleton, which means it's probably safe to assume it was one of the game's iconic crabmen. Although no date is specified in the story, we know that Vanadium Inc. wasn't founded until the 2020s, so that might imply that this is the first appearance of one of the crabmen who are apparently much more commonplace by the time the game begins in 2057. It's also important to note that McMurdo Station is relatively close to the mysterious island featured in The Tomb of the Phoenix, which took place in the Bellingshausen Sea. That means it's possible that the mutant the scientists were studying may have been collected from that same mysterious island. And finally, it's worth noting that this is one of the few references made to the Phoenix Project still being active after their primary funding was pulled in 1986. It confirms that the United Nations did continue to fund the organization, but that it only provided enough money for minimal operations. It also seems to confirm that the organization was revealed to the public in the 2020s, around the same time that the Pandora virus was also revealed to the public. That may not have been a coincidence. And that brings us up to date with the latest official Phoenix Point fiction, though I'm sure they'll have even more for us in the future. But until then, this is RetconRaider signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and don't forget, while I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out the latest news by visiting the official website and the crowdfunding campaign on Fig. Links are in the description.